America's national pastime can be traced to the 18th century. Alexander Cartwright understood for this game to succeed, it needed definition. 90 feet between bases, 9 innings, 4 balls, 3 strikes, 3 outs, and how to run the bases to score. The full life that Jesus offers has a framework, a pattern with guidelines and order. It begins at home plate, connection, the potential, the power is here. First base, character, winning within. Second base, community, winning with others. Third base, competence, winning results. It's time to live a home run life.
Maybe you're here and you weren't here last week, and maybe you're asking, what is a home run life? Well, a home run life, what it basically is we believe in the words of Jesus. Because this is what Jesus said, what our life is supposed to be. It's John 10:10. Let's read this out loud. The thief cometh not but for to steal and to kill and to destroy. And I am come that they might have life, and that they might have it more abundantly. And when he's talking about they might have life, he's talking about you. He's talking about me. He wants us to have an abundant life. He wants us to have a home run life. So last week we talked a little bit about kind of all the bases and kind of what the whole thought is of the series. And we're going to go into the patterns. And I said we're going to take some time with every one of these bases. And we're not going to try to go through it really fast. But the first thing I wanted to talk about this week is the first place that you go to is this home plate. And it's the opposite of what you would think about. You know, when you're talking about a home run life, you would think that I'm going to talk about how to have power, how to be strong, how to win, how to make, God show up and bless all my plans and make everything turn out perfect, to make my life easy. But that's not how things work always in the kingdom of God. That's why this message is called The Power of Powerless. Look at somebody near you and say, the power of powerlessness. Do you guys believe that there's power in powerlessness? That's a good word, isn't it? That's a lot of powerlessness. I had to look it up. It is a word, I promise. But when we're looking at the power of actually this whole series is based upon this guy. This pattern was found with this guy named Joseph in the Bible. And when I talk about Joseph, just so you don't get confused, I'm not talking about like Joseph and Mary, the parents of Jesus, Joseph. I'm talking about Joseph, the son of Israel, one of 12 brothers, this Joseph in the Old Testament in Genesis. And we're going to go through the life of Joseph. We're going to go through this story, and we're going to kind of break it apart a little bit at a time. And we're going to break it apart at every single base and show how this story shows us the way to live a home run life. And as a matter of fact, by the time we're done going through Joseph's story, we're going to realize that God uses the same pattern with every single person in the Bible that lives a home run life. He uses this same exact pattern. And he also uses that same pattern with you and me. If we want to live a home run life, we're going to have to go through and experience some stuff. And I'm going to read a few verses, and I'm going to talk about Joseph a little bit. But let's read. You can read with me. It says, one night Joseph had a dream. And when he told his brothers about it, they hated him more than ever. Listen to this dream, he said. We were out in the field tying up bundles of grain, and suddenly my bundle stood up, and your bundles all gathered around and bowed low before mine. His brothers responded, so you think you will be our king, do you? Do you actually think you will reign over us? And they hated him all the more because of his dreams and the way he talked about them. So here's the thing with Joseph is he did have a dream. It was really from God. He actually had another dream that was from God, and it was even worse. And in this dream, the stars and the sun and the moon were all bowing down to him. So he's saying, not only you and not only not only all the other people in the world, but my mom and my dad, everybody's going to be bowing down to me. And his brothers hated him. And one thing Joseph is going to find out is just like all of us, when we get this big dream, and some of those big dreams come from God, and some of those big dreams are our own dumb ideas. Anyone ever have one of those dreams? Those tend to not work out well. But when they come from God, or whether they do or not, we all dreamers, we find out that dreaming a successful life is far easier than building one. Dreaming a successful life is far easier than building one. And I found this image on Google Images. I think I've seen it on Facebook years ago. But maybe you can identify with this. This top thing says, your plan. And there's this straight line from wherever you made your dream until you get to your goal. And this bottom one says, reality. And I don't know if you can see it. I'll try to get this image to where you can download it. But it's full of pits and obstacles and snowstorms and tigers and swimming across oceans full of man-eating sharks and through the fire and through the storm and through snakes. And you finally face a bear at the end. And I love the end after you get to it is there's this volcano that erupts. Anyone's plans ever feel like this, that you feel like life is so much harder than you thought it would be? Things are so much harder to navigate. All of these things are harder to navigate than we thought. Connection with God, dealing with our character, having community and friendships that matter, and doing everything we do with excellence. All of these things are filled with peaks and valleys and hard things to go through, and Joseph found it no different. Joseph was going to have to discover the power of powerlessness. And here's where I want to step in for a second. Some of you have gone to church for a long time. Some of you have seen a lot of TV preachers. Some of you have heard a lot of people promise you that if you do A, B, and C, like read your Bible and pray and be good to people, that your life is just going to work out easy. That you're not going to have to face some hard things. But that's not what I find when I read the lives of people who made a difference in the Bible. And if you're finding that your life maybe isn't as easy as you thought it was, you're in really good company. Because God uses people like you. God uses people like you to accomplish things that you never imagined that you could. God uses people like you to influence others in ways that you never even realized that you influenced them. God uses our brokenness to bring healing. I know you've seen it. I know you've had somebody come alongside you and say, you know what, I don't know exactly what you're feeling, but I can tell you God was there when I went through this. And I don't know what your this is. Been some pretty awful things for many people, but there is a power in powerlessness. And here is the first truth that we have to come to realize, that when we talk about our plans, and even if a plan is from God, even if we got a promise from God, even if we know I stepped in the direction God told me to and it's still not working out. Let's read this out loud. God is true to his promises, but not our timetable or game plan. Anyone else discover that along the way? Something took a lot longer than you thought it would. Something was a lot harder than you thought it would be. Something wasn't turning out the way that you thought it would. And for Joseph, God allows him to go through a whole bunch of stuff. And we see it as strikeout after strikeout at this plate, where he's trying to hit a home run. But what God is doing is he's taking him through this process by which he builds godly character. The hard things in life are the very thing that God uses to build us up. Let's read some more verses from this story of Joseph. He meets his brothers a little later down the line, and his brothers love this dreamer. Let's read out loud. But when Joseph's brothers saw him coming, they recognized him in the distance. And as he approached, they made plans to kill him. This is serious stuff. And they said, "Here comes that dreamer," they said. "Come on, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns. We can tell our father a wild animal has eaten him. And then we'll see what becomes of his dreams." See, Joseph is on this. Why wouldn't he think that? Why wouldn't he think that when God gave him this dream, that this is what his reality was going to look like? Let me tell you about Joseph. Joseph's granddaddy was this guy named Abraham, who was a friend of God and knew God personally. Joseph's dad and his grandfather, he grew up hearing these stories about God and his faithfulness. He grew up hearing about how God was going to bless their family. He grew up hearing about how God was going to make this Abraham the father of many nations. He grew up hearing about how this family out of all the world was specially favored by God. And not was only this family specially favored by God, but Joseph was his daddy's favorite son. Joseph had this coat, this robe that was put on, and many of you have heard of the coat of many colors. Maybe you've even seen Joseph in his Technicolor Dreamcoat or something along that lines at a play or something. But Joseph was dad's favorite, and he believed he was God's favorite. And he treated others as if they thought he was the favorite, and the way that he presented his dreams may not have been great, but Joseph got on this plan that was supposed to look like this, and it wasn't very long at all before Joseph found himself in a pit. Have you ever been in one? You ever been in a pit? You ever wonder to yourself, where is God? Where is God? Maybe your health was failing you. Maybe the health of someone you loved is failing them. Maybe you lost your job. We went through a financial crisis about 10 years ago, and many people lost their homes. Many people have lost everything they own. And here's the deal. When we want to think to ourselves, this base is called competence. And you know, when everything's going right at work and the checking account looks okay and the crops come in well, and however it is that you define success, we say to ourselves and we say to others, God is blessing me, God is blessing me, God is blessing me, right? But when the diagnosis don't come back right, when we have a box on our desk when we show up for work, when things aren't easy in marriage, when there are those days when you said, why did I ever want to become a parent? When there are those days when your children are grown and you tried to raise them to know God and suddenly they live their life as if God didn't exist. Don't we often ask ourselves, where's God? God, where are you? Where are you? God, what are you doing to me? God, how could you let this happen? And we think we're striking out because we're basing our life upon success at the wrong plate. Connection with God is the most important thing to living a real home run life. A life where God really can use you to make a real difference in the life of people. Connecting with God doesn't come easy, and it doesn't come without loss, and it doesn't come without fear, because without fear, you would never know how strong your faith can be. Because God meets us in those broken moments, and there's a reason that it happens. We think we don't know why it's happening. But I want you to look at your life different after you leave this series. After we've gone through all these bases, I want you to see things differently than you did before. And my hope is that you would understand this, because let's read this out loud. The supernatural is just the opposite of the natural. The supernatural is just the opposite of the natural. Now that seems counterintuitive, don't it? We think of super and we think of heroes, right? Superheroes are people, they're just really gifted people. You know, they're strong, they can fly, they can turn invisible, whatever superpowers they are. But when we say the supernatural, we're not talking about supernatural humans. We're talking about a supernatural mountain-moving faith that makes a difference in the lives of others, and it's the opposite of the natural. And the best way I can explain it is when you've got children, you know, when babies are born, like right back there, when they're born helpless, right? They can't feed themselves. They can't change themselves. They can't do anything for themselves. They're born completely dependent upon their parents and their caregivers. But as they grow, you hope that eventually they learn to do the things. The idea of growing up is that you become more and more independent. My oldest son graduated from high school on Friday, and that's kind of they call it a commencement, which is a new beginning. It's when you're supposed to be handing off the invisible baton in life, and you're supposed to be becoming independent, and our goal is that they would be able to feed themselves and clothe themselves and hopefully get a job to support themselves, and that's our goal. I heard somebody say, you know, when God gave us babies, He wanted them to be really cute so that we would take care of them. But He made them teenagers so that we would want them to live on their own. And maybe that's true for you. Maybe it's not. Maybe you want your baby to stay home. But there's a part of you, right? No matter what, it's time for you to go. But it's actually the exact opposite in the supernatural. In the supernatural, the way that it works is that spiritual growth is the process of moving from independence to dependence. You see, we reach that place when we think, I've got life all figured out. I can take care of myself. I'll go to college. I'll get a job. I'll have everything worked out. I'll have my 2.3 children, and I'll retire by the age I'm 60 with $1 million in my 401k. It looks something like that, right? We think we've got it all figured out, but all of those things tell us that we are independent. But sometimes God allows those pits and those valleys and those sharks and those storms to come into our lives because He's trying to teach us how to have a home run life. And a home run life doesn't always look so perfect and easy. A home run life is about learning to connect with God. And I hope that maybe you're here and you're not a hardhead like I was. Because I was a hardhead, and I had to learn through many things like Joseph did, many pits and valleys where I was left with nothing. And I don't know if you've been there. I don't know if you're going to be there. But I want to tell you what I discovered at the bottom of every pit I've ever been in my life. Every time I've ever realized that I have nothing but God, the revelation has always come. I may have nothing but God, but all I need is God. Just like that song we sang, I want more of you, God. I want more of you, God. No matter how hard this thing is that I'm going through, if I could just have more of God, I can make it through. He'll get me through this. He got me through that. He'll get me through this too. There's a faith and there's a trust that comes from depending on God. And I think that we can see how this works in our lives by the coats of Joseph. Now, I was praying and I was talking about how I was going to communicate how God works out this connection with God and sometimes uses the hardest things in our lives to help us get up to the plate prepared to hit a home run. You see, we think that's the very thing that's striking us out. We think it's the very thing that's taking us down. But it's actually the very thing that's going to give us a power that's beyond anything you ever imagined in the natural. It's a power that's supernatural. But the coats of Joseph helping us understand how God grows us spiritually. I was praying and I was thinking about, and I don't know if you guys ever get it, but sometimes I'll get a download from God and it's buckets of information that come in the blink of an eye. And as I was in that time of prayer and I seen these coats in a different way than I did before. Now, before I go back to what Bible times are, I want to just think about today. You can tell a lot about a person by the way they dress, can't you? Now, some pastors don't like wearing suits and ties, so that when you come into the church for the first time, you may not know who the pastor is. But there are churches that you walk in and you see how that guy's dressed, and you know immediately that dude's the pastor. Or maybe you have someone who comes into your business, the place where you work, and just by what they wear, you know they work for the government, right? This dude's here for an inspection, I can tell. Just by the way they're dressed, there's this certain authority, this certain thing. And it was no different in biblical days. In biblical days, everyone had an outer dressing called a coat or a cloak. And people could tell a lot about that person by their clothes. As a matter of fact, the shepherds in the fields, they could tell who that person was from a half a mile away just based upon what they were wearing. In this story of Joseph, when Joseph goes looking for his brothers, there's a guy that says, "Oh, I seen your brothers, they're on their way to Dothan." Well, how did he see them and know it was because of their clothes? He knew exactly who they were based upon their clothing, based upon their cloaks. And Joseph stuck out like a sore thumb, right? He's wearing this coat of many colors. Has anyone ever seen one of those iridescent cars that is it purple or is it yellow? It's got that really cool. I knew a guy who'd done those paint jobs. They were like $8,000 that he would charge to do one of those kind of paint jobs. And clothing was no different back then. It was a coat of many colors. They had no way to describe this fabric, and this fabric was very expensive back then. That's why Joseph was the only one of the sons that had one of these coats. And even coming from a wealthy family, Joseph stuck out like a sore thumb, but he's wearing this coat. And this coat represents everything that he is. It represents his identity. It represents his parents' house. And as I thought about all the things, let's read this out loud. So when Joseph arrived, his brothers ripped off the beautiful robe he was wearing, and they threw him in a pit. But when they ripped off that robe, they ripped off more than just his robe. They ripped off his parents' coat. They ripped off his birthright. You remember everything that I said about Joseph? He was the most blessed child in the most blessed family on the entire face of the earth. And in a moment, they ripped that off of him and stole his identity when they ripped off that coat. They ripped off that coat and they put goat's blood on it and took it back to his dad and said, "Dad, Joseph's dead." They stripped him of his birthright. When he landed in that pit, he was sold into slavery. He lost his religion. He lost his language. He went to Egypt. They didn't even speak the same language that he did. He lost his status. He lost everything that he was. And many of us know a little bit about how that feels. Anyone who's ever lost a job, you can know a little bit about how that feels. Especially for men, we can identify with that very strongly. Sometimes we tie our worth into our work. And suddenly, our worth is different because our work is different. But he lost all status, and probably one of the big things that you can take from people is their ability to take care of themselves. But everything he was, he lost in that moment. He lost dependence upon anything. And I tell you, these are the same things that we have to go through in order to win dependence with Christ. When we think about our birthright and everything that we are by birth, you think about those things. Maybe you were raised in church and you think that makes you a Christian. That makes you no more than a Christian than you hanging out in your garage makes you a car. You got to have your own faith. And you got to have a faith that's not built on religion. It's not a system of rules. You got to go through some things where you see God show up in a real way. And that's the way you get to know him personally. There's a different language that they speak. Sometimes I got to work on not speaking my Christianese language, because sometimes I'll quote King James and people look at me like I'm weird, and because I'm not speaking their language anymore, so I've got to change the way that I communicate. But even coming from where I was to coming to Florence, you guys speak a different language than what I speak. And it's more than just my Michigan accent, which I don't really have one, but you guys sometimes say I do, so whatever. But there's a different language that you speak. There's a different language that, I have to learn some farming language and figure out what all that is, because you guys are well versed in a different kind of deal than I'm used to. Status, everything you are, it's so hard to lose, isn't it? Isn't it so hard to lose status? But Joseph lost that coat. And when we're even connected with God, when we're asking, God, where are you? Instead of thinking God's punishing you, I want you to start thinking about, God, how are you trying to grow me up? What are you trying to teach me in this? God, help me understand that what I really need is you. And then this other coat, it's Potiphar's slave coat. You see, when Joseph fell into that pit, eventually they got him out of that pit and they sold him into slavery. And he ended up in this guy's house named Potiphar. And when he was in Potiphar's house, the Lord blessed him, but he did work really, really hard. He worked really hard to learn a new language. He worked really hard to become better than all the slaves around him. He wanted to be, the best of the best. He's making the best of a bad situation. And eventually he gets this slave coat. And this coat's on him because, he's the one in charge of all the slaves. So, I might be a slave, but I'm the best slave there is. I'm winning this competence thing. And maybe some of you feel this way at your job right now. It may not be the job you want, but at least you're the head dog in charge at that job that you don't want. And it may not be what you dreamed of, but you're still going to do the best you can at it, right? But we think that we're winning because we win that. But he's in Potiphar's house and he's winning this battle, and something happens that turns the whole core of events. He loses his coat. Anyone want to know how he lost his coat? Check this out. Potiphar's wife starts to take an interest in him. And she came and grabbed him by his cloak, demanding, "Come on, sleep with me." Joseph tore himself away, but he left his cloak in her hand as he ran from the house. And people say the Bible is boring. some major drama happening here in the 39th chapter of the book of Genesis. There's this woman who's making advances at a young man who's a slave, and you got to know what it meant to be a slave. This guy is late teens, early 20s, which by definition, right, he's full of hormones and, and there's this woman who's propositioning him. And he's looking at a future that doesn't have any of the things that he ever dreamed of. He'll never have a wife. He'll never have a home. Maybe he's thinking that it was a big temptation, but Joseph, he didn't do that. He tore himself away and left his cloak in her hand. And what happened when she still held the coat? She accused him of doing the very thing that he refused to do. And he found himself without that coat. And he found himself losing everything he had earned. He found himself losing the success that he had had, the position that he had attained, all the work, everything was gone. Gone in an instant. His whole identity as the head of Potiphar's house was ripped from him. And then he was thrown into a prison. And in the prison, he would once again learn the power of powerlessness. How does any prisoner have power? Now, I don't want you to think of your image of a prison in 2019. I know what we think about a prison in 2019. Everybody has a color TV on their bunk with cable connected and three squares and a cot, and we think they have it too easy and all of this stuff. You see, in those days, prison was prison. If somebody didn't bring you food, they would probably let you starve. You didn't have a toilet in your room. Need I go further? Yeah. Prison was prison. How could there be power in that powerlessness? You see, then God gave Joseph a prison coat. You see, this is a coat that no one could see. Let's read this verse about the coat that God put on Joseph. Let's read this out loud. But the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and extended loving kindness. And the Lord gave him favor with the prison warden. It's a different kind of coat. It's a coat that wasn't identified by what he's seen because he was wearing this favor from God. And this coat, this prison coat, represents God's favor and God's grace. See, I don't believe clothes make the man. I don't believe it for a minute that clothes make the man. I believe the content of someone's character, the relationship they have with God and others, those are the things that really matter in life, because those are the things that really matter to God. And you can tell when someone's covered in God's favor and God's grace. There's just that something about them. And you know that something about them kind of people. You meet them in this room many times. And there are many that are not in this room that are usually in this room, but you know who I'm talking about. God's favor, God's grace. And he's covered in that. And I want you to see what happens when you live a life where you're winning connection with God. When connecting with God becomes bigger than your dream, then God connects you with your dreams. When connecting with God is bigger than your dreams, it's then that God connects you with your dreams. It says in Psalms, if you delight yourself also in the Lord, he will give you the desires of your heart. Notice delighting yourself in the Lord comes first. It comes foremost. And ain't nobody tricking God. You might fool me. You might fool everybody else. I might fool you. But there's no tricking God. He knows our hearts. But when we have that connection, And then we start to win on all these bases: character, community, competence, excellence. Then we find there's a new coat that's given to us. It's called the palace coat. Now, Joseph was in the prison for years, and he thought he's never going to get out of here. And he interpreted dreams for a couple of guys, and the one guy that made it through back to the palace, he said, when you get back, can you tell the Pharaoh about me and tell him that I'm wrongly in prison, that I'm here for something that I didn't do. I did the right thing, and I got in trouble for it. Can you put in a good word for me? But the guy forgot all about Joseph when he got back into Pharaoh's house. Until one day, Pharaoh had a dream, and he wanted to know how to interpret it. And suddenly that guy remembered. He said, you know what, there's this guy in prison who interpreted a dream for me one time. And then, as miraculously as the coats were ripped from him, a coat got put on him. When Pharaoh seen that he had the wisdom to know how to rule through 7 years of feast, followed by 7 years of famine, Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of the entirety of the kingdom of Egypt. He said, there is no more powerful man in all of the world besides you, Joseph, except for me. And to prove it, here is what I'm going to do. Let's read out loud. Then Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand and placed it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in official, fine linen clothing and hung a gold chain around his neck. And what that palace coat represents is authority. And when you round these bases and you win here, and you win here, and you win here, you will eventually find yourself at the last level of connecting with God. And it's this authority that comes from God. It's this authority that people know that God has touched you. People know that God is speaking through you. They ask you to pray for them because they know that God is hearing your prayers. There's this authority that comes when you've won, when you haven't compromised your character, when you've made relationships as important to you as they are to God, when you've done the work that God's given you with excellence, there's this palace coat that comes. But here's the first thing that we got to learn before we ever get to that spot. Let's read out loud. God does not join us to help us with our agenda. We join Him. Isn't the first way the way most of us live? God, I got this plan. Can you bless it? God, I got this thing I want to do. Can you bless it? God, I got this idea. Can you bless it? And you're wondering, sometimes He blesses it, sometimes He doesn't. How do I know when He's going to bless? How do I know when He's not? Well, the problem isn't your plan. The problem is your agenda. Is it your agenda or is it His agenda? And sometimes, even when we are successful in His agenda, it doesn't always work out the way that we thought it would. On earth. But there's coming a day. You know, if you read Hebrews 11, there's this whole list of all the faithful people. Faithful people that you've heard their names. Abraham, Moses, David. These faithful people that conquered kingdoms, these faithful people who drove out armies, who won wars, who done these miraculous miracles all in the name of God. But then there's another list. It's a list of people who were beaten, people who lost their lives, people whose names go unnamed. It's all up to God to say which one I'm going to be. But both of those kind of people still lived a home run life. They still lived a life that they're going to see Christ face to face and hear Him say, well done, my good and faithful servant. Servant. It's His agenda, not mine. And if we can figure out, God, why is this coat being taken from me? We can also figure out how to go through the progression of stages. Do you guys want to know how to get from here to there? Just look at Joseph's coats. There's a pattern. You drop your parents' faith and you pick up your own. You drop your parents' religion and you pick up a relationship with God of your own. You stop depending on the works of your own hands and figure out that God's going to show up in His grace. And you stay faithful and loving, and you stay on the path, and eventually you will find yourself in the place of the palace. And here's the crazy thing that I have come to know, is that it doesn't only happen once in life. It happens again and again and again and again. And I don't know where you are on that circle, but I know God's best is that He wants us to live a life that's a home run life. And we may be in a pit, we may feel like a slave, we may be in a prison, or we may be in the palace. But if you'll keep your eyes on Christ and make the most important thing connection with Him, you'll live a home run life. And I'd like to close with, again, keeping this definition of success in our forefront of our minds. It's this quote from John Maxwell. Let's read it out loud. Success is knowing God and His purpose for our lives, growing to reach our maximum potential, and sowing seeds that benefit others. And you can do those things no matter where it is you find yourself in that circle. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we come before you in the name of Jesus. And Lord, I pray for those who are in the pits. And I pray for those who are in the slave house. And I pray for those who are in the prison. I pray for those that are in there physically, spiritually, mentally, emotionally. And I ask that you would lead us all into your paths of righteousness. That you would help us learn to depend on you no matter what it is we're going through. So that we will see that your goal is to put a ring on our finger and kingly robes on our back. Maybe not ones that people see, but we will be a success in your eyes. It's in your name we pray. Amen.